In a mansion where power spoke louder than the truth, an employee was humiliated, accused without proof, and forced to sign her own dismissal while hiding a secret capable of changing everything. With a broken heart and her life crumbling before her eyes, she left in tears without imagining that injustice would transform into the strength that would make her be reborn in a way that no one could predict. Years later, when the man who condemned her believed he had left the past buried, a devastating discovery forced him to face the real dimension of the mistake he committed and the cruel price of decisions made with pride. Between guilt, silence, overcoming, and a truth kept for too long, this is a story about profound losses, wounded dignity, and the moment when life collects, without mercy, everything that was done without listening to the heart. Before getting to know this emotional story to the end, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next reports that show how destiny always finds a way to reveal the truth. The rain fell suddenly over Avenida Paulista on that March morning without warning, without a previous cloud that justified the intensity with which it arrived, as if the sky had received the news before Renata. She was standing at the bus stop with her wet coat stuck to her body, her eyes fixed on the white envelope she held with both hands, with such care that anyone passing by could imagine there was something precious inside. And there was. There was a truth that she still didn't know for sure what to do with. Renata Souza was 32 years old, with black hair tied in a simple bun that daily life didn't let loose, and hands calloused from years of honest work. For 6 years she had woken up before 5 in the morning to take 2 buses and arrive punctually at the Carvalho mansion in the Morumbi neighborhood. She cleaned, organized, prepared, resolved. She was the type of worker who didn't need a task list because she already knew by heart what needed to be done, in what order and with what care. The Carvalhos never needed to ask twice. The envelope in her lap had come from a pharmacy. She had entered the night before in a hurry, not wanting to believe her own symptoms. The result was positive. Simple as that. One line and another line. A new life beginning, while the old life had not yet finished happening. She closed the envelope, took a deep breath and faced the overcast sky. It wasn't the moment to break down. It never was the moment. She had to work. She had a late water bill, rent due, and a mother with high blood pressure who depended on the monthly medicine that Renata bought without complaining. She tucked the envelope into her apron pocket with the care of someone guarding a secret and followed the usual path. The Carvalho mansion was one of the most imposing in Morumbi. A dark iron gate, discreet cameras, a garden trimmed with a ruler. Dr. Henrique Carvalho had built that fortune with the family construction company, inherited from his father and tripled by his own ambition. He was a man in his early 50s with direct speech and a look that measured everything before speaking. He treated employees with cold politeness, the right distance to never commit to anything beyond the professional relationship. Renata always knew what her place was in that house and never tried to cross that line. But on that day, something was different as soon as she entered through the service corridor. The housekeeper, Donna Fatima, didn't greet her as usual. She looked away. The cook, Sonia, who every morning exchanged at least 2 words about the weather or the soap opera, stayed quiet and turned her back when Renata passed. That silence pulsed, loaded with a tension that she still couldn't name. Renata went straight to the cleaning room, took the usual materials and began the routine. That's when she heard Dr. Henrique's voice calling through the internal intercom. "Renata, come to the office." The tone was neutral, but too neutral. She knocked on the door and entered. The office had dark wood bookshelves from floor to ceiling, a glass desk and 2 visitor chairs that seemed never to have been used for comfort. Henrique was standing, his back to the window, and there was another person in the room, Claudio, his brother-in-law, sitting in the corner with his arms crossed, and a countenance that Renata didn't know how to classify immediately. Later she would understand. Henrique went straight to the point. An envelope with money had disappeared from the office drawer, a considerable amount. He had checked the cameras, and Renata was the only employee who had been in that room in the last 2 days. There was no other explanation. Renata felt the ground move, not from guilt but from incredulity. She had never touched anything that wasn't work. 6 years of loyalty, 6 years of silence and dedication, and that was being said to her as a sentence, not as a question. She tried to speak. She said she hadn't taken anything, that she had never done that he could search her belongings, her house, whatever. But Henrique had already decided, not with anger, which would be almost more human, with coldness, with the same conviction of someone cancelling a contract that had ceased to be profitable. Claudio remained silent during the entire conversation, and Renata noticed in a quick flash that he didn't look her in the eye. But she couldn't interpret that at that moment. She was too deep inside her own shock. The paper was placed on the table. Termination for just cause. Renata's hand was trembling when she picked up the pen. She opened her mouth to tell the truth, to tell about the envelope in her apron pocket, about the life that was beginning inside her, and that would change everything. But when she looked at Henrique, she saw a man who had already left the conversation before it even ended. He didn't want to hear. There was no room for the truth there. She signed. She returned the pen. And before leaving, with a voice firmer than she expected to have at that moment, she just said, "I hope you never regret making a decision without first hearing the truth." Henrique didn't answer. Claudio continued without looking at her. Renata left through the service door with her bag on her shoulder and the envelope in her pocket. The rain had intensified outside. She walked to the gate, heard the click of the automatic lock behind her, and stopped in the middle of the wet sidewalk, unable to take another step for a few seconds. She didn't cry there. The crying would come later in the bus bathroom when no one could see. For now she stood under the rain, feeling the weight of it all collapse upon her at once, mixed with the cold water that ran down her face as if time itself were wiping away what she couldn't express. Inside her pocket, the envelope folded in half kept the only secret she had decided to take away in silence. The days that followed were the hardest Renata had faced since she arrived in São Paulo. She had left Minas Gerais at 18 with a backpack, her mother's blessing, and the naive certainty that the big city would make room for those who truly worked. That certainty had been tested many times over the years, but it had never been torn from her so abruptly as on that March morning. The apartment where she lived was small, at the back of a house in the Lapa neighborhood, cheap rent, a window that faced the neighbor's wall, and pipes that grumbled at night. But it was hers. She paid on time, kept it clean, knew the name of the doorman and the owner of the bakery on the corner. She had built a small but stable routine there, and now, without a job and without a professional reference, that stability was beginning to crack at the edges. In the week following the dismissal, she spent the first 2 days in bed. Not from sadness, but from exhaustion. Her body had absorbed the blow in a way that her mind was still processing. On the 3rd day, she woke up before the sun and sat on the edge of the bed with her account book in her lap. She did the math. The money she had saved was enough for 2 months of rent, maybe 3 if she cut everything superfluous. There was no room for long laments. There was something liberating she discovered in doing those accounts. Not because the result was good, but because by putting the numbers on paper, she was doing something. She was acting. She was choosing not to stand still, waiting for the weight of circumstances to decide for her. It was a very small form of control over a situation that had taken almost everything from her. But it was real, and it was hers, and Renata had learned long ago to value small forms of control when the large ones are not available. Renata picked up her cell phone and started sending resumes to domestic employment agencies, condominiums, and cleaning companies. Each message was written with care, without errors, with her 6-year history of work in a family home listed with precision. What she didn't mention, because she knew it would be decisive in the wrong way, was that she had been fired for just cause. In practice, that note in her work booklet was a mark she carried without having deserved it. Responses came, some of them, but in the first selection process she attended in person, the recruiter looked at her belly, still discreet, but already noticeable, and said with a canned smile that she would call as soon as there was a compatible vacancy. Renata thanked her, left, and walked 2 blocks before leaning against the wall of a closed store and taking a deep breath. There was no anger. There was only the cold recognition that the world had a way of reacting to solo motherhood that didn't depend on individual kindness, but on an entire system built to eliminate what was inconvenient. In the second week, she got a night shift at an office cleaning company in the Faria Lima region. The salary was lower than what she received at the Carvalho mansion. The commute was longer and the work was heavier. But it was work. She accepted without negotiating because she knew that at that moment she had no room for it. She spent the nights cleaning meeting rooms, corporate bathrooms, and corridors lit by cold light, while trying not to think too much about the future. During the day, while trying to rest, she began attending a free basic administration course offered by Senac in the neighborhood. She had seen the advertisement on a bakery bulletin board and entered almost on impulse, like someone entering the first shelter that appears in a storm. The classes were in the afternoon 3 times a week, and the teacher was a middle-aged woman who spoke about cash flow and inventory control with the enthusiasm of someone who believes that knowledge can change someone's life. Renata sat in the front row and took notes on everything. It wasn't that she had a clear plan. It was more an instinctive feeling that she needed to learn something that would put some power back into her own hands. The night work gave her income, but it was too precarious to be the permanent answer. She wanted to understand how things worked from the inside, how a company organizes itself, how a proposal is made, how the cost of a service is calculated. They were things she had always executed without knowing how to name them. Now she wanted to name them so she could control them. It was in one of these classes that she met Berenice, a woman in her 40s who had lost her job as a supervisor in a supermarket chain and was trying to start over. The two began sitting together, exchanging handouts, and then, naturally, having coffee after class. Berenice was loud where Renata was quiet, expansive where Renata was contained, and the two fit together with the simple logic that sometimes the people who complement each other are precisely the ones destiny throws into the same corridor at the same time. Renata didn't talk about the pregnancy for weeks, not because she was ashamed, but because she was still trying to understand what it meant for the future she was trying to build. When she finally told Berenice one afternoon, when they were sitting on a park bench eating cheese bread from parchment paper, her friend didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she put her hand on Renata's knee and said, "Then we're going to have to run faster." And that was exactly what Renata needed to hear. Not pity, not advice, just someone by her side who still believed there was room to run. The pace she had imposed on herself was brutal, but she sustained it because she had a focus that most people around her didn't understand. Every reel that came in was divided with precision. Every free hour was filled with study or intentional rest. She didn't have time to feed resentment, but she hadn't forgotten it either. It was more than resentment, actually. It was a cold clarity about the kind of injustice that happens when someone with power decides that the truth is inconvenient. And that clarity, instead of paralyzing her, had become the silent fuel for everything she was building. Meanwhile, at the mansion in Morumbi, Dr. Henrique Carvalho's life continued spinning on its own tracks. The construction company faced audits and contract renegotiations that consumed his attention. The days were long and the dinners were lonely, because his wife had traveled to care for a sick relative and was taking a long time to return. The house was large and silent, and sometimes in the middle of the silence he remembered that phrase the employee had said before leaving. A small phrase, but one that had taken root in a corner of his memory with a persistence he couldn't explain. The months that followed brought a cruelty that no plan can predict. Renata had learned to work pregnant, to study pregnant, to balance herself on the crowded public transport at 2 in the morning with swollen feet and a heart in a forced rhythm of calm. She had built around herself a kind of functional shell. On the outside, a woman who could handle things. On the inside, someone who had learned that if she stops to feel everything at once, she cannot continue. It was on one of those work nights that she felt for the first time that something was wrong. A different pain, low, that wasn't tiredness. She leaned against the cleaning cart and stood still for a long moment in the deserted corridor of the empty office. She tried to tell herself it was the weight of the hours, that it was the effort of a long week. But the body has a way of communicating what the mind refuses to accept, and this time she listened. Berenice was the one who took her to the emergency room. The two sat in plastic chairs at 3 in the morning, and Renata held her friend's hand with a strength that wasn't from fear but from something that didn't yet have a name. When the doctor came out with the test results and his face had that expression trained to soften what cannot be softened, she already knew before hearing the words. The pregnancy had come to an end in a natural and irreversible way. No pain to explain, no culprit to hold responsible. A loss of the kind that silence absorbs because human language was never built to describe them well. Berenice cried. Renata didn't, not that night. She stayed quiet during the entire way back, with dry eyes fixed on the car window, watching the empty city pass as if it were someone else's life. Only when she arrived at the apartment and closed the door, far from any witness, did she lean her back against the wall, slide down to the floor, and stay there, in the dark, without making any sound, just letting the weight of it all press inside her, like a large invisible hand that doesn't ask permission. The next day she went to work. This wasn't heroism, it was necessity, and it was also a choice. Renata had spent her entire life watching women around her dissolve in difficult circumstances, and she had decided very early that she was not going to dissolve, not because the pain wasn't real, but because she understood, with a clarity that life had engraved in her with a razor's edge, that the world doesn't stop while you cry. And if the world doesn't stop, she also couldn't stop more than strictly necessary to stay on her feet. Grief happened in parts, silently, while she swept corridors and studied spreadsheets. It happened the moment she passed the maternity section of a pharmacy and had to look away. It happened when Berenice unintentionally mentioned something and then remembered and turned red with embarrassment. Renata learned to respond with a smile that said, "You can speak, I'm fine." And there was a truth in that, not total but growing. 3 months after the loss, she finished the administration course with the best grade in the class. The teacher called her after the final class and said she had a rare reasoning for small business management and that there was a free incubator for female entrepreneurs in the Villa Maddalena neighborhood that she should check out. Renata wrote the address on a piece of bread paper and took it home with the same care with which she had taken the pharmacy envelope months before. The incubator was managed by an NGO that supported women in situations of economic vulnerability. Renata went to the first informational meeting almost out of curiosity, without a formed expectation. But what she heard inside made something move within her, a gear that had been installed deep inside her, without her knowing its name. The women in the room told stories similar to hers, jobs lost unfairly, restarts made with their own hands, businesses built from scratch with little money and much clarity of purpose. The plan Renata began to sketch there wasn't ambitious on paper. It was simple, direct, and based on what she knew better than anything else, cleaning and organization work done with dignity, punctuality, and trust. She wanted to create a small cleaning services company for offices and commercial spaces, not the type of company that pushes the employee to handle an impossible job in the shortest time possible. She wanted something where those who worked knew what they were doing, were paid what they deserved, and were treated as part of something that made sense. Berenice joined the project without being invited, simply because one day she appeared at Renata's desk with a spreadsheet she had made at home and said, "I did the numbers. We can start with what you have if we cut here and here." And Renata understood she had a partner. It took almost 1.5 years for the company to leave the paper and actually become operational. In that time, Renata continued in the night job, saved every cent she could, attended every incubator meeting, learned about contracts, invoices, permits, tax regimes. She learned with the same silent discipline with which she had cleaned the Carvalho house for 6 years, but now learning for herself, for something that would be entirely hers. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Dr. Henrique Carvalho received the news that the construction company's internal audit had identified financial irregularities in transactions from the last 2 years. The person responsible for reconciliations during this period was the sector that Claudio supervised. The irregularities didn't have a face yet, but the shadow had already begun to fall. Henrique ordered the investigation expanded, without yet imagining where it would point. On those long nights in the office, between contracts and reports, that phrase still resurfaced sometimes. "I hope you never regret making a decision without first hearing the truth." He had learned to push that thought to a deeper corner, but it persisted in coming back. RS Soluções em Limpeza e Facilities was officially born on a September afternoon, when Renata signed the company's incorporation documents at a small table in the incubator room, with Berenice by her side and the course teacher watching with a smile that was, without exaggeration, that of someone who had placed a bet and seen it work out. The name had been chosen by Renata with a simple intention, the initials of her own name, without flourishes, without an elaborate fantasy name. It was her work, it was enough. The first contract came from a dental clinic in the Pinheiros neighborhood, thanks to a contact of Berenice's who knew the administrator. It was a small contract, 3 days a week, a modest amount, but for Renata it was the beginning of what she had spent almost 2 years building mentally before it existed on paper. She herself went to do the first day of service, not for lack of employees, but because she wanted to understand with her own body what that space needed before delegating to anyone else. The second employee she hired was Joanna, a 43-year-old woman who had worked for 12 years at a cleaning company that closed abruptly, leaving everyone without notice and without settlement. Renata didn't ask if she had formal experience registered in her work booklet, because she already knew from her own experience that there is a type of competence that paperwork cannot measure. She talked to her for 20 minutes, observed how she spoke of difficulties without playing the victim role, and said, "You start Monday." The third was Miriam, who had been sent away from a condominium after being sick for 3 weeks. The fourth was Priscilla, whom no one wanted to hire because she had a history of domestic employment, and the corporate market looked at that as a lack of qualification. Renata looked at all of them and saw what she saw in herself. Work that was waiting for someone with enough vision to see where others saw a problem. In 18 months, RS had 7 employees hired with formal contracts, basic health insurance, and a monthly meeting where Renata listened to each one of them. It wasn't a large company, but it was a fair company, and in the service sector, being fair was already a distinction rare enough to generate a reputation. There was a specific culture that Renata had built there, shaped directly by what she had experienced on the other side of the labor relationship. No one was discarded without a conversation. Problems were discussed openly before becoming unilateral decisions. Every employee knew her schedule in advance, received the materials she needed without having to ask 3 times, and there was a direct line to Renata for any issue that couldn't wait. They were simple, basic things, which in other environments were called privileges, but which Renata had decided to call simply the minimum that any worker deserves. The contracts grew by word of mouth. One clinic referred a law firm, which referred a brokerage, which referred a co-working space. Renata learned to make presentations, to calculate proposals with a healthy margin without selling herself cheap out of anxiety. Berenice took care of the finances with a precision that compensated for her years out of the formal market. The two were different in everything and complementary in everything that mattered. On the other side of the city, during that same period, the audit of the Carvalho Construction Company had reached a result that Henrique needed to read 3 times before accepting what was written. The financial irregularities pointed to fictitious transactions carried out in parallel accounts created with documents from non-existent suppliers. The person directly responsible was Claudio, the brother-in-law, the man who had been sitting in the corner of the office that March morning, with his arms crossed and his eyes averted. Henrique stayed alone in the office for a long time after the accountant left. He didn't call anyone immediately. He sat with the report in his hand and felt something that wasn't anger, at least not in that first moment. It was a kind of internal collapse, like when a support block is removed and the entire structure begins to show the cracks that were always there. Because from the moment he understood that Claudio had operated financial irregularities for years, other memories began to fit together differently. The envelope with money that had disappeared from the office drawer, the time when it had happened, the unrestricted access Claudio had to the house for being family, the ease with which everything had been resolved with a quick dismissal, without a real investigation, without a serious inquiry. Claudio was in the room that day, and Claudio had never looked Renata in the eye. Henrique got up from his chair, went to the window, and stood looking at the city. São Paulo was out there with its usual indifference, buses and skyscrapers, and too many people in too little space. He had given orders in that room without even bothering to investigate. He had made a decision that destroyed someone's life because it was more convenient to point at someone in a weaker position than to question someone within his own family circle. He called the legal department the next day. He requested Claudio's immediate suspension, the termination of any partnership or family benefit linked to the company, and a complete investigation with a report for the external audit. Then, after all those measures, he sat down and began to think about how to find Renata Souza. He no longer had her address. He didn't have her contact. She had vanished from his life in the easiest way possible, with a signature on a paper that now weighed in a way that no contract had weighed before. The secretary took 2 days to locate her name in old records. The most current information that appeared was a CNPJ registered the previous year, RS Soluções em Limpeza e Facilities. Henrique stared at those letters for a moment before understanding what he was seeing. She had built a company. She had built it while he was signing contracts, and she was cleaning offices at 2 in the morning. She had built it with what was left after he took what he thought he could take. He asked the secretary to check if the company provided services in the region and if there was any form of legitimate commercial contact. He wanted to find her. But for the first time in many years, he didn't know exactly what he was going to say when that happened. He looked out the office window for a long time that afternoon. São Paulo was out there with its usual indifference, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that he had been so inside his own world for so long that he had lost the ability to see what was happening around him. He had built a company, a reputation, a solid public image, and he had destroyed, with a hurried signature and a judgment without investigation, the life of a woman who for 6 years had been one of the few people in that house to treat every room with the respect he rarely stopped to notice. That perception didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived as things arrive that were true from the beginning, but that we only see when we stop moving enough to truly look. Exactly 5 years, 2 months, and a few days had passed since that March morning, when Renata had left the Carvalho mansion with her bag on her shoulder and her dignity intact despite everything. She had stopped counting the days at some point in the 2nd year, when she realized that the calendar had ceased to be a ruler of pain and had become simply the rhythm of work. It was a discreet victory, one of those that no one notices from the outside, but that on the inside functions like a lever. Renata was in a meeting with a new client when she received the message. It was an architect who had opened her own office in Itaim Bibi and needed cleaning service twice a week. The meeting was going well. The architect was direct, knew what she wanted, and didn't try to negotiate the price down with creative excuses. She was the type of client Renata liked to work with. When she left the meeting with the signed contract in her bag, she picked up her cell phone and saw a message from Berenice with 3 exclamation points, which was their informal code for "read this now." The message said, "They called from Carvalho Construções. They want to schedule a meeting to evaluate a facilities contract. I left your number with them. What do I do?" Renata read it twice. She stood in the middle of the sidewalk for a moment, with the November sun hitting her face and a cold clarity spreading inside like ice in warm water. Carvalho Construções. There was no other Carvalho of that size in São Paulo in the sector. It was Henrique's company. She walked to the bus stop, sat on the metal bench and watched the flow of the street while she thought. There was a sign in that which she didn't want to romanticize, because she had learned not to romanticize coincidences. It was possible that it was a legitimate commercial search, that the RS name had reached there through some contact in the network she had built. It was also possible that Henrique knew exactly what he was doing. She replied to Berenice with a single line, "Accept the meeting, schedule it for next week." Berenice called immediately, of course. "Are you sure it's that man's company, Renata?" And Renata answered with the calm that had cost much to build. "I know, exactly for that reason." She spent the following days as usual, working, resolving, managing. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, there was a territory of memory that she traversed in silence during that week. The office room with the glass table, the termination paper, the weight of the pen, the phrase she had said before leaving. It wasn't anger she felt when revisiting that. It was something more complex, a mixture of clarity and distance, like someone looking at an old scar and recognizing that it is part of the body without it hurting anymore. On the day scheduled for the meeting, she chose her clothes with care but without exaggeration. A navy blue blazer, tailored pants, shoes that were elegant without being ceremonial. She didn't want to look like she had dressed up to impress. She wanted to look exactly like what she was, a businesswoman who was there to discuss business. While she dressed that morning, she looked at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror of the new apartment in Villa Maddalena and stood still for a second longer than necessary. The woman in the mirror was not the one who had left crying through an iron gate 5 years earlier. She was someone who had made that entire journey and arrived on the other side with something that couldn't be measured in contracts or revenue, but that felt like a solidity that no dismissal could ever remove again. Berenice went along. They arrived at the address of the Carvalho Construções headquarters, a glass tower on Chukri Zaidan, 10 minutes before the scheduled time. The receptionist led them to a meeting room on the 12th floor, with a view of the marginal traffic and coffee in a thermos in the center of the table. Renata poured 2 cups, one for herself and one for Berenice, and waited. Henrique entered 3 minutes late, accompanied by an assistant who carried a folder. When he saw Renata, he stopped for a second. Just a second, but she noticed. Then he continued walking, greeted both of them with a handshake, and sat on the other side of the table with a composure he had spent his whole life cultivating, and that now seemed to cost a different effort. The meeting began formally. The assistant presented the construction company's demand. They needed a facility service for 3 floors of the administrative building, daily cleaning with a fixed team, and a monthly service report. It was a considerable contract, the largest that RS had ever received a proposal to evaluate. Renata presented the company with precision, without nervousness. Berenice stepped in with the numbers when needed. They had rehearsed, not because they were afraid, but because professionalism was the only language Renata had decided to speak in that room. During the entire presentation, Henrique remained quiet more often than normal for someone in a client position. He asked questions, but the questions were restrained, as if there were another set of questions he was saving for a moment that had not yet arrived. At the end of the presentation, the assistant said they would formalize their interest in writing the following week. Both sides exchanged cards. Berenice went out ahead to answer a call, and it was then, in that interval of seconds, when Renata was putting the documents in her bag and the assistant had gone out to get something, that Henrique said, without enough volume to reach anyone but her, "I need to talk to you, not about the contract." Renata continued putting away the documents. She didn't hurry the movement. She raised her eyes to him with an expression that was not hostile, but was also not inviting. "You can speak," she said. He hesitated. It was the first time in a long while that she saw hesitation in that man. "Not here. There are things I learned recently that need to be said to you, personally, with as much time as you think necessary." Renata closed her bag, put the strap on her shoulder and stood up. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Send the contract proposal in writing by Friday. If you want to talk about other things, you can schedule a time through the same channel, but I choose when and where." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the knob and added, "And I hope you have thought well about what you are going to say, because words said late also have weight." She left. In the corridor, Berenice was waiting with her phone tucked away, and a questioning look that contained at once curiosity, concern, and that compact loyalty that didn't need words to communicate. Renata passed her and squeezed her arm lightly as she walked. "Let's have lunch, I have a lot to tell." In the restaurant 2 blocks ahead, with plates of food by the kilo on the table, and the usual corporate lunch noise around them, Renata told everything. Berenice listened without interrupting until the end, her spoon still in her hand, her eyes going from surprise to indignation to something that could only be called admiration. When Renata finished, Berenice was silent for a few seconds, looking at the table before raising her eyes and saying, "You knew exactly what you were doing in there, didn't you?" And Renata replied that she had only known she wasn't going to leave that meeting room as anything other than what she was, the owner of the company they wanted to hire. The proposal arrived on Friday, as Renata had requested. It was detailed with the correct values and without attempts to lower the RS price below what had been presented. Berenice read line by line, compared it with what they had projected, and said it was a good contract. Perhaps the best they would have signed up to that point. Renata also analyzed it, agreed, and sent a confirmation in writing, saying they needed up to 7 business days to return with the signature. It wasn't procrastination. It was time to think. The contract was too good to reject for personal reasons, and accepting for strictly financial reasons was also not something she would do without first understanding what was happening on the other side of that table. The message Henrique had said before she left the meeting hung on her like a hook. There were things he had discovered recently that needed to be said to her, which meant he had discovered something. And what could he have discovered that involved her 5 years later? She requested the meeting by message. She chose a neutral cafe in a neighborhood that was neither hers nor his on a Tuesday afternoon when RS had no external meetings scheduled. She didn't take Berenice. Some conversations need to be had without a witness, not for fear of what will be said, but because certain truths ask for a space where there is no obligation of immediate reaction. She arrived 5 minutes early. She sat at a table in the back, ordered water, and left her cell phone face down on the table. When Henrique entered, she saw him before he saw her. And in that second, she noticed what she had vaguely noticed in the meeting, but hadn't let register completely. He was older than expected, not in years but in expression. There was a different weight on him, not of position or responsibility, but of something that had been carried inside for longer than it fit. He sat down, ordered coffee, waited for the waiter to walk away, and then stared at his own hands for a moment before speaking. When he began, it was slowly, with the care of someone who knows that each word will land in a way that cannot be undone. He told about the audit. He told what it had revealed about Claudio, the parallel transactions, the fictitious accounts, the years of embezzlement covered by access that no one had questioned because he was family. He told that the dates and records matched the period when the money had disappeared from the office drawer at home, that Claudio had access to the mansion frequently, that he came without warning, that he was the type of presence the family had normalized to the point of no longer questioning. Renata listened to him without interrupting. She kept her eyes fixed on him during the entire speech, not with judgment, but with the attention of someone checking every detail to decide what to do with the information. When he finished, there was a silence between the two that lasted long enough for his coffee to cool a degree. "So it was him," she said. It wasn't a question. "It was him," Henrique confirmed. "And I didn't investigate anything. I simply decided it was you because it was easier." She didn't say anything immediately. She stared at the glass of water. There were many things she could say at that moment, and there was a strange clarity in realizing she didn't feel like saying any of them with anger. The anger had existed, had been real and had been useful, had been transformed into fuel that kept her legs moving in the worst moments. But it was on the other side of work she had done internally, slowly, without completely realizing it until that instant. "Why now?" she asked. "The audit. Was it recent?" "Concluded 6 weeks ago," he said. "And the contract from the meeting. Was it a coincidence or did you look for me?" Henrique didn't look away. "I told the secretary to locate your name when the report was ready." She approved that honesty with a slight nod of her head. "So the contract is real, but the meeting was a pretext to find me." "The contract is real. Your company has a reputation that would justify it alone. But yes, it was also a pretext." Renata picked up the glass, took a sip, and put it slowly back on the table. "You know that doesn't undo anything, don't you? What happened, happened. I signed that paper. I left under the rain. I was left without a job, without a reference, with a note in my booklet that I took a long time to figure out how to work around." "I know," he said, "and even so, you are here. Even so." She was silent for a moment more. Then she took a deep breath and said, "There is something you still don't know. And I need to decide if I'm going to tell you, not because you deserve to know, but because I refuse to keep more things out of consideration for someone who didn't consider me." Henrique became completely still. There was something in her tone that warned him that what was coming would not be simple, and he had enough reason to accept that warning before hearing it. She told him she had entered the mansion that morning with a pharmacy envelope in her apron pocket. She told him she had received the result of a pregnancy test that same morning, and that she had chosen not to reveal that because she realized the decision had already been made, and that the truth would not change the result, only expose her even more to something she was not in a position to defend. That she had left in silence, with that truth entirely to herself, because it was the only thing that still belonged to her completely at that moment. Henrique was looking at her with an expression she had no name to give immediately. It wasn't guilt yet. It was the first stage of an understanding that was arriving faster than he could absorb. "Where is the child?" he asked, and his voice came out with a crack he didn't try to hide. Renata looked at him for a long second before answering, and in that second, the cafe around them continued existing. Plates, conversations, the sound of a cup against the saucer. Common life, all around, indifferent to the weight of what was about to be said. Renata answered without looking away. She said she had lost the pregnancy a few months after the dismissal, that it had been alone at night, in an emergency room, with plastic chairs and too much white light, with the only person who cared at that moment being a friend she had met in an administration course. That she had gone through that without support, without financial stability, without anyone knowing the full story, and that she had moved on because there was no other choice she would accept making. Henrique remained motionless for a long time. He wasn't the type of man who lost his composure in public, and Renata knew that by heart she had lived with that composure for 6 years from the inside out, sweeping the corridors of the mansion where he moved as if the space were a natural extension of his control over the world. But in that cafe on that Tuesday afternoon, with the sun coming in through the window from the side, she saw him fracture. Not in a dramatic way, in an intimate way. An internal break that the face cannot completely hide when someone is looking closely. He covered his face with both hands for a moment. When he looked back at her, there was something in his eyes she recognized as true guilt, not the performative guilt of someone who wants to absolve themselves, but the guilt of someone who completely understood what they did and knows there is no logical operation that undoes that. "I destroyed," he began, and then stopped, as if there were no sentence that could complete what he had started to say without sounding insufficient. "You made a wrong decision," Renata said with a firmness that was not cruelty, but was also not comfort. "Destroying is a word that implies that I destroyed myself. I didn't destroy myself. I rebuilt, but not because of you, rather despite what you did." She let that land, and then with the same tone she added, "I didn't come here to receive apologies. I came because I decided I wasn't going to continue carrying things that are not mine. What is being said here is so that you know the full truth, not so that you feel better with it." Henrique nodded slowly. There was a question in his face that he formulated slowly, as if he knew he had no right to it, but couldn't not ask. "What can I do?" Renata tilted her head slightly. "That is a question I answered for myself before accepting this meeting." She opened her bag, took out a document folded in half, and placed it on the table between the two. "A few weeks ago, I had begun to structure a project, a welcoming space for women who were dismissed from their jobs in periods of vulnerability, pregnancy, illness, grief. A place where they can have basic legal support, professional guidance, and connection with opportunities. I called it Projeto Renacer." She opened the document and explained briefly and clearly what the project envisioned: a physical headquarters, a partnership with an existing NGO that had the legal structure, a team of volunteers with legal training and career guidance, and an initial fund to cover 3 months of operation, while they would seek recurring funding. Henrique read while she spoke. He read with the attention of someone who knows they are before something that goes beyond what they had imagined finding that afternoon. "I want you to fund the project for 2 years, Renata said. "Not as a donation, not as public relations philanthropy, as an obligation you assume in the face of what happened, and that will be documented as such. In addition, I want a formal statement from the construction company recognizing that my dismissal was unjust and based on a false accusation. And I want Claudio's removal from the company's operations to be permanent." There was a silence. "And the RS contract?" he asked. "The RS contract will be decided based on exclusively commercial criteria and by my partner. I don't mix the two things." She closed the document and left it on the table. You can take this to analyze with whoever you need. I have a deadline for a response by the end of the month." Henrique stared at the document for a moment, then he looked at her. "You didn't come here to forgive, did you?" Renata looked at him with an expression that was neither cold nor warm, but clear as glass. "Forgiveness is an internal path that each person takes in their own way, in their own time. I did mine without needing any scene. What I am offering here is a way for you to do something useful with the regret, instead of just carrying it." She picked up her bag, stood up. Before leaving, she left the RS card on the document. "Send the response in writing. If you accept the conditions, my lawyer will get in touch to formalize everything." She looked at him for the last time with a serene expression. "Good afternoon, Dr. Henrique." And she left. She crossed the cafe without haste, opened the glass door and entered the São Paulo afternoon with its buses and noises and crowd. She walked to the corner, stopped, and breathed the humid air of the city. Berenice had sent a message asking how it had gone. Renata looked at the screen for a second before replying only, "It was what it needed to be." There was no euphoria. There was no defeat. There was something more like the soft click of a door closing in the right place, not with violence, but with the precision of someone who finally found the missing frame. She had entered that cafe as a woman who had survived something unjust. She had left as a woman who had decided what to do with it, and the difference between those two conditions was all the distance she had traveled in the last 5 years. And there was more than distance in that difference. There was the proof that some stories do not need a defeated enemy to have a dignified ending. They only need a person who decides, at a certain point in the crossing, that what was done to her will not define what she does with what she has. Renata had made that decision in silence, gradually, without telling anyone and without waiting for anyone to validate it. It was an internal decision, the kind that doesn't appear in the news but that changes everything. Henrique's response arrived in 12 days, not at the end of the month like the deadline Renata had given, but earlier. She interpreted that as a sign that he had thought without stalling. The letter was formal, written with legal assistance, but there were parts in it that carried a different weight than the standard language of agreements. Henrique expressly recognized that Renata Souza's dismissal had occurred based on an uninvestigated suspicion, that subsequent investigations identified a third party responsible for the embezzlement in question, and that the company expressed its formal regret for the way the process had been conducted. Renata's lawyer, a middle-aged woman who had provided voluntary consulting for the incubator where everything had begun, read the document 3 times and said it was legally correct in every point. They formalized the agreement at the notary's office. Funding for Projeto Renascer for 2 years, public recognition of Renata's innocence through internal and external communication from the construction company, and Claudio's permanent removal from any operation linked to the company or group companies. Berenice was present at the signing. When they left the notary's office, she waited until they reached the sidewalk to hug Renata tightly, and then say, with tearful eyes, she tried to hide with a wide smile, "You knew from the beginning you were going to get here, didn't you?" Renata replied that no, she had only known she was going to keep walking, and sometimes keeping walking is the only way to discover where the path ends. Projeto Renascer opened its doors 3 months later, in a large room in the Barra Funda neighborhood, with walls painted in raw white and natural light coming in through large windows. It wasn't luxurious. It was functional, clean, and welcoming, the 3 things Renata had learned to value above any elaborate aesthetic. The partner NGO brought structure. The volunteer lawyer organized the first legal guidance sessions. Berenice created the system for registration and monitoring of the women served. In the opening week, 11 women signed up. The following week, there were 23. They came from different stories, but with a common axis. They had been dismissed at times when they were fragile, and the market had treated that fragility as a demerit instead of a circumstance. Projeto Renascer didn't promise jobs. It promised listening, guidance, and connection. Sometimes it was enough for someone to rebuild what they had lost with their own hands, as Renata had done. Henrique appeared at the opening. He hadn't been invited, but he had called to ask if he could go. Renata left the decision to the lawyer and to Berenice. The two agreed that yes, but that he should not speak publicly, nor be introduced as the funder at that first moment. He accepted without question. He went, stayed in the back of the room during the ceremony, heard the stories of the women who presented themselves, and left before the end without calling attention. After that day, the contact between them remained restricted to what the agreement provided: quarterly reports of the project sent to his office and transfer confirmations via the legal department. Renata had been careful so that formality was the only point of contact, not out of spite, but because she had learned to distinguish between what needs distance to be healthy and what simply needs to be closed. That relationship needed distance to be useful, and useful was all she needed it to be. RS Soluções grew throughout that year with the construction company contract, which Berenice had signed independently, as Renata had said she would. The two hired 4 more employees, opened a second CNPJ for the corporate event organization branch, and launched an internal program where more experienced employees mentored the new ones. It was RS becoming what Renata had imagined in those administration classes, not just an efficient company, but a structure that replicated opportunity. On a Saturday in July, almost 6 years after that March morning under the rain in Morumbi, Renata went to the neighborhood where she lived before moving to a larger apartment in Vila Madalena. There was no objective reason to go. It was more a desire to close a circle consciously, to pass through that place as the person she had become, and recognize the distance traveled without needing anyone to witness. She passed the street of the small apartment. The window that faced the neighbor's wall had new curtains. The gate had been painted. The bakery on the corner still existed, with the same owner she greeted in the morning. She went in, bought a coffee and a cheese bread, sat at the outside table and watched the street for a while. She thought of that March morning, without being able to name exactly what she felt. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't anger. It was something close to gratitude, but not for the pain itself, rather for what she had discovered she was capable of doing within herself. She had survived an injustice, a loss that found no adequate name in the language, nights of heavy work, and a silence she had sustained for years without begging to be heard. She had built something real with what was left when everything seemed to crumble, and most importantly, she had decided what to do with the truth when she finally had room to say it. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because the truth, when kept for too long, occupies a space inside the person that could be used for something else. She finished her coffee, folded the paper napkin, left it on the table, and stood up. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Berenice. 15 new women at Renata this week. We have to hire a coordinator. I already sent 3 resumes for you to see. Renata smiled at the screen, tucked away her phone, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and kept walking down the street, that the July sun turned golden like a promise that this time was not being made by anyone else, only by herself, to herself. The end of the story. If Renata's story touched something in you, know that it was created for that, to remind you that reconstruction is possible, that dignity is not requested, it is built, and that sometimes the greatest turnaround in life begins with the courage to sign a paper, leave under the rain, and decide that you are going to keep walking even without knowing yet where to. If you are following our channel, leave a comment telling which part of the story stayed with you the most. Your opinion makes a real difference. If you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscription button now, because every week we bring stories like this, human, intense, and impossible to leave in the middle. And if you want to recommend it to someone who needs to hear a story of a new beginning today, share it now. We'll meet in the next video.